Thank you for coming for the first event of Entangled Life. This is the first of 10 events that is going to happen every month on Wednesday until the end of the year. And the aim of the project is to bring together organization of the community, artists, academics, and experts to talk about themes connected with the climate crisis that are not so talked about, or not really in a context in which I hope you feel relaxed and in a kind of safe space to ask questions and to share experience and who knows, possibly get inspiration for your life, your work. And this is the first one. You know that the name is The Art of Just Transition. And sorry, I got with the chairs. I got a bit. Just transition is a word that is not well known by many people. And I think it's a pity because it's quite relevant for what's going on now. It's connected with the climate change. It's connected with the community, in a large sense. That could be your neighbor, could be the neighbor of your community in a larger sense. I mean, the island sense. Okay, and we have the honor to have fantastic guests tonight, and that I thank very much, and I'm going to let them speak, but I'm going to introduce them, and I will start in alphabetical order, because, and we have our bio, so I'm going to read it, and then I will leave the floor. I'm sorry, I need to take off the glasses. We have Rachel Fallon, that is also so kind to give us images of her fantastic work. So Rachel Fallon uses sculpture, drawing, photography, and performance technique to deal with themes of protection and defense of domestic realm and address women's relationship to society. Recent work include Yellen Bangkok, I Am Present, a collaborative performance-based piece relating to queer and female representation in public spaces, commissioned by Budapest Galleria and Kinsale Museum in Hungary, which has been performed in Budapest, Manhattan, and The Map with Alice Maher as part of the Magdalene series. We have all images of this, it's fantastic. It was shown at the Ruared, most recently at the Off Biennale in Budapest, at the IAC in New York, and at the Dock in Lettering. Her work is held in public collection, including IMA, Our Council of Ireland, the National Museum of Ireland, and the Museum of Art in Warsaw. She lives and works in Dublin. And then we have Egle Gusciute, and is an interdisciplinary sociologist interested in migration, discrimination of ethnic minorities, environmental sociology, and gender inequality in sport. Her PhD work centers on public attitudes toward migrant and refugees and discrimination against ethnic minorities in Irish and European contexts. Currently, she is an assistant professor in sociology at the University College Dublin, where she researches and teaches environmental sociology. Egle has previously held academic and research posts at the University College in Cork and the Economic and Social Research Institute. Thank you for coming. And last but not least, we have Michelle Murphy, a research and policy analyst with Social Justice Ireland. Michelle provides research, policy analysis, and strategic engagement on sustainability, rural development, and impact on policy on income distribution and social inclusion. She has produced several pieces of social policy research on sustainability and just transition, including policy option to deliver on our climate targets through just transition framework, the impact on Brexit on just transition and rural community in Ireland, and the impact on our climate targets on regional development. Michelle is a member of the Just Transition Commission, National Mirror Group to support the EU climate neutral and smart cities mission, the implementation advisory group for our rural future, and the advisory group on a waste action plan for a circular economy. Maybe I will start with Egle. If you can, please tell us, what is just transition?
I think you're right in saying that just transition is often a term that's kind of misunderstood or not used that commonly, but actually it's a very simple term. So in terms of, I suppose, the global challenges that we face locally, nationally, globally, obviously anthropogenic climate change is one of the big ones. And a way to address that is to transition to low carbon, carbon neutral, however you want to call it, societies. But in that transition, what's really important that that transition is just in a sense that it includes all individuals, all communities, different sectors, and no one's kind of left behind. So as a sociologist, I suppose I'm particularly interested in it because often when we look at inequality or environmental inequality, they really overlap. So we often see that people who are already marginalized or at the stigmatized and excluded from society or suffer from a variety of different inequalities also suffer from environmental inequality. So in kind of sociological terms, we talk about that generally people who are exposed to environmental goods, as we call it, so nice green spaces, good socioeconomic resources generally benefit from that transition already. So for example, people who might be benefiting from, let's say, efficient energy because they're using renewable energy, people who are seen as kind of conscious consumers because they're buying sustainably, locally, organically, etc. However, those people generally already have a certain privilege that allows them to do this. But they're kind of deemed as sort of the good citizen, the people who are sort of doing the good work or environmentally conscious. And what's often less spoken about, particularly I think in the kind of just transition or climate change movements, is that people who are burdened with the environmental bads. So things like air pollution, noise pollution, for example, not having the resources to acquire, let's say, organically, seasonally sourced food, not people who are somehow opposed to renewable energy, but maybe don't have the means to transition to renewable energy, and they often can be kind of forgotten. And I think, again, in just transition, it's really important to think of that local, national, and global level. So obviously, for example, at the local level, we could think of, let's say, green spaces. So my colleagues in UCD, for example, did this tree mapping exercise, which was fascinating, and they showed that in Dublin 4, so kind of where UCD is located, there, I think, I don't know, I can't remember the exact number, but way more trees than residents. So basically, for one resident, there's like something, let's say 10 trees. And then they compare that to Dublin 8, so an area we're currently in, and there was, I think, 10 residents per one tree. And you can think about how that sort of, it might seem like, well, maybe this is just geography, we're more closer to the city centre rather than, let's say, more the suburbs of Dublin. But obviously that's not a coincidence, how certain areas are much more, let's say, have more green spaces. Green spaces are good for your mental health, physical health, obviously environmentally more pleasing to be around. And I think during COVID in particular, we saw that kind of, how that can impact people. So I'm sure people here can remember having been restricted to a 5-kilometre radius, if you are lucky enough to live in a nice area, that 5k radius maybe isn't so bad. Maybe, you can do a nice walk in your local area, enjoy green spaces. But imagine if you're living in an area that has no green spaces within the 5-kilometre radius, and maybe you live in conditions which are really overcrowded, maybe your housing conditions aren't great. Then that 5-kilometre radius becomes very, very small, and that space becomes very, very small. Obviously at national level, again, I often ask my students when we talk about environmental inequality, and they'll often cite examples from America, for example, environmental racism, citing certain industrial sites and exposing people, for example, for marginalised communities to toxins and so on. And then I ask them, well, what about Ireland? Do we have environmental inequality in Ireland? And they'll often say, no, I don't think so. And it's only when they start looking at their local communities that they suddenly start to realise, for example, where we're citing recycling centres. So it's not coincidence that they're not cited or like place located, for example, on the south side of the city, but they tend to be on the north side of the city, often around, for example, council social housing areas which are already deprived in terms of amenities that are available. So it's not coincidence that they're cited there. If you're ever, for example, let's say passing north side versus south side, do observe, for example, how many billboards you'll see. So for example, if you go towards, let's say, from here towards, let's say, Fairview, Marino, that kind of area. Lots of billboards. There's a recycling centre, which is literally located right in the middle of social housing. So people who already have not been provided with amenities they should be provided with, then they have a recycling centre where everyone comes and just basically disposes of waste or what they no longer need. Versus if you were to go the opposite side of town, let's say towards, let's say UCD, towards Donnybrook, green spaces, trees, much different environment. So kind of, how that can then impact that transition as well, I think is important. And then I think also at looking at the kind of the global level is really important. So we often kind of, I think, again, forget perhaps how different things might be in the global south and the global north. And often that conscious consumer who, for example, might, let's say, decide not to eat meat, but to eat avocados, which maybe are imported from Chile, and then faces the impact, doesn't think about the impact that has on the local communities in the global south in terms of the water consumption, in terms of displacing smallhold farms, and so on. So I think that's also really important to consider. Kind of the just transition really encompasses everything, and making sure that if we really want to, I think, address climate change appropriately, I think we have to ensure that everyone is included in it. And that sometimes includes kind of having difficult conversations with people. So for example, I think again, sometimes there's this kind of tendency to dismiss climate change deniers. So I'm assuming here no one is a climate change denier. But if you kind of exclude people from the conversations, then you are excluding they're still part of the community, part of the society, and I think bringing everyone together as much as possible is important. So I'm not advocating for, giving necessarily saying that we have to kind of take all views at the same level, but I think making sure that everyone is included in that transition is really important. For example, one of my PhD students, Oksana, she's working on a very interesting study on the bioeconomy in Ireland and looking at the social aspects of it. And one of the case studies is in Gorsh, County Galway, where there was massive community opposition to biogas plants. And the community biogas is basically kind of these plants which can use waste from agriculture to produce biogas. But the opposition from the community really comes because they were not consulted with it. So it's not that there's some sort of anti-whatever, they just actually weren't consulted as part of the plan. So this massive plant was going to be built in their local area without any consultation with the local community, the greenway that's there, how that was going to impact the community. And then there's been like back and forth between the developers and the community. And it's just, I think, a really good example which shows how you have to include everyone in the community to ensure that if you want to have some sort of success, whatever project it is you're implementing. So I think for me, just transition is really thinking of how to include everyone as much as possible in the kind of, and addressing, particularly kind of, I think, in just transition again, giving voices to people who are often not heard. So a lot of my research, for example, would focus on gender. So gender in the environment. So things like female farmers, for example. So again, farming would be often seen as an industry that's causing a lot of environmental issues. But we can't just exclude them as an industry. They have an important economic value as an industry, but also they have, a significant cultural and social element, particularly for rural communities. The female farmers, for example, are part of the community that hasn't been really considered, and their visibility is often kind of not really seen as that important. So we're kind of looking to explore that. Or looking at public spaces and green spaces, and for example, how females and people who identify as female, how they use them, for example, for exercise. So we have a pilot study which is very interesting, which shows how basically anyone that doesn't identify as a cisgendered man, how that use of public space is very constrained for them. So how they engage in, for example, taking in certain, I suppose, precautions before going for, let's say, for a run, how people might not run at certain times because they don't see it as safe. And that might seem like that big of a deal, but it really means that public space, which should be open to everyone, is actually only usable by certain members of the community at specific times, taking specific precautions, which is very sad. So I think it is important that kind of we just make sure that in Just Transition everyone's included and the voices that aren't sometimes heard are heard.
Thank you. Michelle, you've just been appointed to the Just Transition Commission. tell us what's going to happen.
So I've been appointed to the commission. Actually, we're meeting tomorrow. So we agreed our work plan. This was our role. It was a climate action plan. This is the boring policy bit in 2021 where the commission was sort of committed to. We were only established last October. We had our first meeting in December. But our role, according to the terms of reference from government, is to be the public voice on planning for just transition, leading to developing a shared understanding and identifying the challenges, solutions and opportunities for Ireland. So, great. So, so the role of the Commission is to be a public voice on planning for just transition, leading to developing a shared understanding and identifying the challenges, solutions and opportunities for Ireland. So there's 10 members, there's 11 in total, and I am there to represent the community and voluntary pillar, which is 17 organisations representing carers groups, persons with disability, older persons, children and younger people who are unemployed, rural communities. So my job on the Just Transition Commission is to make sure those voices are heard, and we're having our discussions, we're doing our work plans, and we're talking about research, and we're talking about engaging with government. It's making sure that the social inclusion element is not lost. And it kind of ties in with what Egle said, so that those who are already very vulnerable, and who are already, either living or socially excluded or living in poverty, that they're not forgotten while we sort of make our plans and our policies and talk about funding and opportunities for a transition. And I suppose my job in particular is to make sure that whenever we talk about something, that fairness and equity and equality and making sure that existing problems aren't made any worse is a consideration. Because when you think about it, and it goes back to the point you made about there's a real, people don't see, but there is an upward redistribution of resources, because every single person is contributing to the exchequer, which then goes and funds things like, renewable energy, retrofits, etc. I mean, it doesn't matter who you are. If you get on a bus, you go to the shop, you are paying some form of tax, whether it's VAT, whether it's carbon tax, whether you're employed or not employed. But the people who can avail of the opportunities to have their home retrofitted, to get the new windows, generally they have higher incomes, because and so the advantages are going to those who could probably afford to pay for it anyway, whereas those who can't afford to pay for it don't have the advantages. They're expected to take advantage of opportunities that they simply can't afford. And if you're living in rental accommodation in particular, it's going to be really hard. And I suppose as a country, and that's one thing where we have discussed and we're looking at, is the challenge in terms of environment and home, looking at the proportion of people who are living in rented on accommodation who will be for the foreseeable future. And how do you incentivize the retrofit of rental properties without people being, having to move out while the retrofit is happening? And then what happens? And so there's a lot of challenges, a lot of grappling, but my role is that role, to make sure that, we consider vulnerable groups. And I think it will be a challenge for the Commission. Just transition is, I suppose it's not that well understood, and most of the actual definitions are to do with labour and displacement of labour. So then to date, most of the research, the case studies, they're focused on jobs, which is obviously really important, and the displacement of jobs, but they don't consider, for example, people who aren't represented in the labour force at the moment. People with a disability, for example. And if they're not considered now, they're not going to be considered if we only focus on jobs that will be displaced, because you're not talking about that groups are women, for example, who are only represented in certain industries. So there is a challenge around the definition. I suppose I was part of the task force tasked with kind of putting together, I suppose, some recommendations around establishing the Commission. And one of the things we did grapple with was the issue of the definition. And it's on the Just Transition website, which off the top of my head I don't know, but if you just do a search for it, the definition of the task force is different. It's much more holistic. It's around social inclusion and equity, and obviously it includes the labour element, but it's broader. Of course, it's a bit more clunky then, because you're trying to include everyone's point of view, but I think that's really important. And I suppose the other area that I think will be a challenge for the Commission is that to date, a lot of the focus has been on individual action, which, you know, that's really problematic. And actually, if you look at our own country, primarily the whole focus has been around carbon tax. And people hating carbon tax, not understanding what it's used for, but also the funds from that are also being used for the wrong. Well, no, some of it is being used for positive things, but some of those funds are being diverted to social protection programs around energy poverty. But people are energy poor if they don't have enough money. You're not just energy poor if you live in a house that's not well insulated. And so the problem with diverting carbon tax revenues, which of course they should reduce as people move to more sustainable forms of transport, heating, you should be taking in less money. What happens to the money that's diverted for social protection income programs? Obviously that will reduce, but the position of that person won't have changed. And so I think there's a problem when you look at it from an individual lens, and we really need to look at it sectorally. And to date, the entire focus has been on agriculture, you know, which, you know, given our history and, you know, even our geographical distribution, it's hugely challenging, it's hugely contested. And so it becomes very emotive and it becomes very either or. And even within agriculture, I mean, if you look within agriculture, some sectors within it are doing very well, but the other sectors really aren't. And you have to think about whose voice is being heard, whose voice is not being heard. Is there going to be any burden sharing within the sector? Not just, you know, burden sharing has to happen through the economy and society as a whole, but also has to happen within sectors, you know, and there's no discussion. But I suppose the one thing we really in it, it goes back to your point about your students saying that they didn't think there was sort of environmental injustice. Like, so we talk about transport, but no one talks about flying. And aviation fuel isn't taxed. And if you're privileged enough to get on an airplane, but that fuel is not being taxed, but if someone hops on a bus or a loose or gets in their car, there is injustice. And the problem is we haven't tackled that. And so now what we've, I suppose, kind of enabled is for some section of that industry to say, oh, well, then you're taxing holidays and taxing people. And you're not taxing holidays because it's up to the industry to decide whether they pass on that, you know, that tariff or not, or whether they absorb it. Like, that's up to the industry. And I'm sorry, tonight I was kind of concerned about coming here because most of my work is policy. It's not, but it's nice to be in this space. But it's about thinking, no, it's not about individuals, and we need to move away from that discussion because all of us could make every single change we need to make. But ultimately, unless we can kind of rethink how our economy should function, then you won't get the changes we need. And I suppose, I don't know if any of you are familiar with John Barry from Queen's University. No. He's written some really interesting work on this, actually, and I will send the links. And I was at, he gave a talk actually for us. We were holding a seminar for Global Justice Day, and he posed a really interesting question. It's like, how is it we can imagine the end of the world, but we can't do something really simple like reconfigure how our economy should work so that we're not doing all the wrong things? Like, how is it with all the advances we've made, with all the technology, with all the research, that we can't think of something simple like reorganizing globalization and the global economy, but we can very easily imagine, you know, Armageddon. And I think that's the challenge. And what's stopping that, and what's driving that? You know, what's that driving that feeling of helplessness? And I think that in the Irish context, I think that makes it hard because we've been quite slow to make change. We have made progress, but I think then people feel, because it's taken so long to make even the small changes that we have made, and people feel like, well, what's the point? But, you know, there's always a point. So you have to show people what the benefits to that point is. And the one thing I will finish on is that the one thing as a commission we will be focused on is that the perfect isn't the enemy of the good. That you have to start small, and if, you know, you can't just let the perfect policy stop good policy happening. So
Thank you very much. And well, we definitely touched what I would call the necessity of having in mind the human rights in all of this. And Rachel has quite some experience in how, well, exactly creating these opportunities of seeing the point, gathering people around ideas and working on something that is visible, that can trigger the point to. Would you like to tell us a bit about your work?
I'm going back to the essential in this moment. So I'm really starting with, most of my work starts with the body and the domestic. So it really is that very tiny moment where you look, or I look at groups of people or people who have incredibly marginalized situations, who have difficulties due to either how they don't fit into society, how they're not accepted within society, or various issues around financial and class barriers. And they would be the most important people that I would work with in that respect. And a lot of it is about making those issues that affect them on a daily basis visible to other people in the communities. So, the most recent, I've just come back from Budapest, and I suppose this is the one that I'm working on most at the moment. And it has a transglobal sort of effect. It originated with the work that I created for the artist campaign to repeal the 8th Amendment in 2018, which were the Aprons of Power. And these were a very particular set of works that were based on stories within my own family and situation, where they were to do with women who had been in the Magdalen laundries. And as part of the reproductive rights and the artist campaign for the reproductive rights that was going on in from 2015 to 2018, it was very much their story that I wanted to centre, because it was a very marginalised voice. In our efforts to kind of modernise ourselves, they were the voices that were most likely not to be heard. And yet there are still people alive who are in Magdalen laundries. There are still people alive who are children from women who are in Magdalen laundries, who are in mother and baby homes, who are in Artane, who are in various different places like that. So it was really, I felt a duty of care to these people and particular people to create this work around that. And what happened with this work was when we won the referendum, and it was based on the very simple aprons that women were made wear in the laundries. And there was a lot of kind of thought around the politics of cloth, the politics of washing, the politics of wearing white, which is a colour that really is synonymous with the upper classes, because it's very, very difficult to keep something white if you don't have possibilities to wash. And it was very much around these sort of kind of ideas, while taking in military aspects, so mottos that come from very powerful places like the Italian Penitentiary Guard. It was the English translation is to ensure hope is our role, which is a really interesting motto when taken out of the prison system. So I was very interested in that, and in the cursing gesture. So the apron gesture of raising the apron is based on anasurma, which is a gesture of cursing that is used in all communities, be it the Igbo women in Nigeria, Chinese women used it at the Great Wall of China, and it is showing your vulva to basically, and raising your skirts to scare off intruders. So kind of a combination of these was used for this work in an effort to give these women back a power or a status that had been denied for them. And in lifting the apron, you become every woman, you become each person. So we become a community. And this work was really successful, but it kept being requested. And people would come to me from Poland, from the UK, from Hungary, and ask me, could I actually create work with them around these sort of themes? And so I created a pedagogical concept around how we would go about this as a community. So I've just come back from a 4th iteration of carrying out the Jelen Vagyok in Budapest. And this is, each time I've gone, another law has been changed. And if you have ever been in Budapest, what you will see is there is a huge number of statues from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and so on, further on. And they are 90% male. So the presence in the street is a very male presence. Women are shown as decorative objects or supplicants. So they are not shown in any particular way of power. And really, all the laws that have been, passed have been very much around, lack of queer visibility, shutting down Pride Parade, shutting down influences from outside, which might help these sort of visibility around queerness. And in Budapest and in Hungary in general, people who are queer, who are Roma, who are trans, and who are women very often of low socioeconomic status, have a really, really hard time having their voices being heard. They are not present in society. They are not present in the governments. They are not accepted within the streets in that way. And they're constantly being shoved. Orban is bringing in more and more laws to actually shut this down. So it becomes really, really interesting as to how you can create a way that slips between overt antagonism and create some sort of possibility to make people visible within a landscape where they do not exist. So Jelen Vagyok was created. It means I am present. It's from the motto Ad Sum, which is a military motto from the Canadian Air Force. And Latin was the main, because of the history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Latin was kept as the main official language until 1884, and it was a language for elites. So this is really about bringing it back to the people, taking it away and bringing it back to the people. And it's really about also, this last performance, the first performance we created in Margaret Island, and that was a place where there is an art walk. And it is, 39 statues of men and 1 statue of a woman, an actor derine. So we stood in front of each of the statues, and the aprons were created over a series of 4 days with local artists and people who are, queer activists in the community, and women who are part of a group of the elimination of violence against women within Budapest. And we worked on these aprons to create them collectively. It's about creating space so that people can have the conversations. These are often women who have not met one another, who have not had an interaction in that sort of way with one another. So it's about creating community. And then we do a performance walk where we raise the aprons at different spaces. Some people wanted to create a more political walk. So I said I would come back on International Women's Day, and we went to Sandor Palota, which is where Viktor Orban has his office. And we had color-coded the aprons so that when they are all raised in unison as a group, they give the colours of the progressive pride flag, which is illegal in Hungary. But each person only works as part of a whole. So one person on their own is not vulnerable. They can raise their apron, but only as a whole, where they all are hidden, their faces are hidden. Can we work as a group? So it's creating that sort of sliding group. And this time we went back and we made another performance in front of the Hungarian National Museum, which is Orban's favourite museum, where he likes to give all of his speeches when he brings in new laws, and where he fired the director in 2023 for showing the photographs as part of the World Photo Exhibition of 5 photographs from a photographer who had created this wonderful collection of photos in a gay retirement home in the Philippines. So it's very much an issue around this, but what we found is there's a real cross-section of issues, because people who are in this situation particularly trans people in Hungary. They're also economically incredibly vulnerable because they can't get jobs, they don't have papers. There's cross sections with the Roma community who are also completely oppressed and victimized, who also have problems accessing jobs, who have problems with violence within the kind of wider community, with also how they're seen. So all of these things kind of all come back to the body, and if your body is not safe, then you have no time to spend thinking about other things like your home, the environment, or anything else like that. And it all has a knock-on effect. It's really, really difficult for people in these situations to work like this. So I suppose what I'm interested in is creating this cross-community and bringing then the aprons. I brought them to New York when I was having an exhibition in New York, and I asked activists, particularly from the trans community in New York, who, it was prior to Trump arriving, but we now know that this is a really, will be a really, devastated community in that way, whose rights will be taken away from them, whose job employment will be taken away from them. And we performed in front of the Supreme Court in New York. And it was very much about saying, we are one people, we have these problems here in Hungary, we have these problems in America, we have these problems in other communities. Is there any way we can make ourselves globally more visible as well? And that's before we even talk about, situations in other countries. I was looking at a lot of the work that came across at the moment, and we talk about how can art be helpful, but there's an amazing group in Congo where they have actually done a huge amount of works around transitional justice in Congo. And they create a lot of costume work and performance work from the recycling and the clothes we give to recycling banks, the electronics that are come from recycling places from the West and are dumped in Africa. Papa Noir Kilombashi they're a really, really interesting group, and they make these costumes and they go out in the streets and they talk to people about why this is coming in and how we can create a community within our own community in Kilombashi in Congo to protest against how we are being dumped on. So I think there's really, there's also people like LaToya Ruby Frazier, who comes from Braddock in Pennsylvania, who is an incredibly interesting artist as well, who has basically, since she was 16, documented through her artworks the decimation of her community and the pollution of her environment through global concerns. So, there is a real place for work like this. The Militia Tomic's works on so many levels. It's the Four Faces of Omarska, which is part of a work that looked at the women in Bosnia who brought a trial case before the court in New York for rape to be considered as a war crime. And it looks at the actual environment that was created around this original iron plant in Omarska, and how the landscape of that has been changed 4 different times in a period of time to create a film set, to create, it's just absolutely horrendous what has been done to what is ostensibly a mass grave. And that is documented through a film. So I think there's a real place for art within this sort of work.
That's clearly this is a transnational issue that is felt in different ways and can be approached in different ways, of course, like probably first looking at the body and then seeing, but talking about the transnationality, do we have any indication or like suggestion or something coming back to the just transition from the European Union? I don't know which of you would like to give us some, just like a hint of information, like we have a Just Transition Commission. We have plenty of article research information regarding what are the issues. What are they suggesting us? There are money coming? I don't know.
Well, just I suppose from the European Union perspective and the European Commission, the previous Commission, there was the Green New Deal, and I suppose there was a very strong focus on just transition. But the new iteration, the word that just transition framework seems to have disappeared, because the focus now is on global instability and industry.
Security.
And how do you make sure you're competitive and how your industry's secure and competitive, which is really concerning because it's really slipped down the agenda. We've targets to meet in terms of emission reductions, but we don't necessarily have transition targets to meet. Ireland is one of the few countries with a Just Transition Commission. There's a Just Transition Observatory at EU level, but it's not run by the European Commission. It's countries that come together to look at, just transition in various ways. So, we're learning a lot from the experience in Scotland, and there's experience in Germany. That's very sectoral, and New Zealand as well, which is very sectoral. I suppose Scotland is the first place, and it's a very close neighbour to sort of grapple with the issue as a whole. But beyond specific emissions reductions targets, and beyond what was a priority for the last Commission, which when you read through the documentation of the new Commission and their priorities, and even what their funding priorities are, they have changed substantially. And one thing I will say that I think will become an issue at a European level is, there's a big difference between distributive justice and procedural justice. So distributive justice is that it goes back to your point that it's, nobody is left behind, that it's fair for everybody, but for those who are furthest behind, they are supported. But that's very different to procedural justice. So if you just take the European Commission approach to renewable energy, for example, if you look at that from a distributive justice lens, then everybody's bill should be reduced ultimately, and everybody should have the benefits of renewable energy, no matter who you are, where you are, ultimately. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what you should see in your bill is being reduced. But at an EU level, there isn't a competency for what happens in member states in terms of, individual utility bills. But there is a competency in terms of procedural justice. The focus will be on industry, because if you're trying to make sure European industry is competitive in, a new global order, and you're looking at reducing costs for business, well, one way you can do that is to reduce their energy costs. So the question is, the European investment in renewable energy and the benefits of that, where will they go? Will they go? And you see, there is a procedural legislative place. So will the majority of those benefits go to support industry, or will they go to support everyone in reducing their bills? So I suppose that's one of the big challenges when you're looking at the priorities of the new Commission. But in terms of just transition, no. There are climate and emissions targets, but there aren't, even in terms of monitoring and indicators, they're not, universally agreed yet.
Yeah, and I think just to add to the just transition, kind of a European perspective, I think the point you mentioned earlier that the focus is generally on jobs and employment. So just transition has often focused as if employment is the only social indicator that matters. But obviously people who are not in the labour market would be excluded, but also that's just a very simple economic indicator to measure. But also I think when we talk about just transition, and if you look at kind of certain areas, particularly from the European Commission perspective, which have been left off the agenda. So for example, the Roma community would be largely disadvantaged, again, wouldn't feature heavily at all, and I think in the European Commission documents or considerations they already would be living often in areas which are very deprived, really poor overcrowding conditions, never mind environmental inequality. So that's only going to most likely become worse unless there's some sort of action. On the other hand, you've got, for example, people who might be affected by climate change and might have to migrate or might become environmental refugees. Again, from the European Commission perspective, the focus is on security of borders. So what they're actually focusing on is managing internal migration and then managing migration at the borders, but also kind of exporting any issue. So making sure that basically what they call in the European Commission terms third countries. So third countries, any country that isn't part of the European Union. So that those countries are basically responsible for somehow dealing with migration issues. So they're not even trying to, never mind the human rights perspective, but even from a kind of sound migration policy, they're trying to sort of export that as if it's another country's sort of problem. And environmental refugees in particular, so it's an area that I'd be particularly, I suppose, interested in terms of research. But from the European Commission, the focus is not on human rights or not focused on, for example, ensuring how to help people or how to protect people, but very much on the securitization of EU borders, I think.
Do they exist a definition of climate refugee?
So
now?
They'd be kind of mixed in academia, there'd be mixed terms used, and some people are like the definition, so kind of anyone who's fleeing, I suppose, due to environmental reasons, because it's seen as something that will become more and more of kind of important area to kind of, I think, explore further. But then other scholars argue against using the term because they feel it's too simplistic, because it doesn't. People migrate or become refugees for generally a number of factors. But I don't think that I personally don't think that using the term environmental refugee means that you can't have any other economic, social, or political reasons. It might be just that maybe the main reason is environmental. Maybe the area you live is no longer livable, so you have to, you have to migrate. And again, that's kind of going to be quite a significant issue, because if we look at the current refugee convention, the definition does not include, there's no term that would allow to include environmental refugees. So that's definitely something I think that we will see as a kind of significant issue. I mean, so many countries are going to be faced with really devastating issues when it comes to climate change, and they're generally countries that I suppose contributed less to climate change. So it's the countries who have contributed the most are the countries who are like, oh no, we don't want environmental refugees, because that's just another kind of burden for us to deal with. That would be sort of the approach. But EU's approach has been very, very sort of security is the main priority.
Thank you.